Give a warm Orange County welcome to Dr. DATIS.
How's your lunch? Are you getting exposed to antigens? Are you sure? So here's the thing, food sensitivities, as we know, is a major thing, and we're at this point where, when you go to elementary schools, there's divisions where people can't bring in certain foods because kids get really sick, right? We never had that experience when we were kids. We have all this explosion of food sensitivity. Apex, for example, has to go through and make sure so many different allergens are not included in lunches when they hold these events, because so many people have reactions to things like milk and gluten and soy and egg and GMO foods and these things, and this is an ongoing issue. So one of the things that we know is that there is a dramatic explosion of food sensitivity, and probably most people in this room have some degree of food sensitivity, and for sure you guys are seeing patients with multiple food sensitivities in your offices, right? And if you're dealing with anyone who has chronic inflammation or autoimmune disease or chronic inflammatory bowel diseases and so forth, they have some degree of food sensitivity. So the question is, why? Do we know? Yes, we do know. Has this been published? Yes, it's been published. So this entire field of reacting to food proteins is something called oral tolerance. Okay? So there's a lot of research in immunology in oral tolerance. Why do you develop food sensitivities? What are the mechanisms that cause a person to have food sensitivities? And that's what we want to really discuss today. So I want to really go into what has been published in the research for all the mechanisms that lead to a person starting to react to dietary proteins. And that applies to your patients that come in and have every single major food sensitivity. How many times have you guys seen patients come in and they do a food sensitivity panel, every single food shows up? If every single food shows up, what are you going to do? Give them the ones they can eat in their diet? What would happen in a couple months if you did that? They'd react to those foods. So this is a very important topic. Now, for us, I know for me personally, just as a practicing clinician, what I've come to discovery is it's more than most of these food sensitivities are just leaky gut, right? Because that's the thing. If someone has multiple food sensitivities, they must have a leaky gut, right? And that's part of the mechanism of losing your oral tolerance, but it's not all of it. So one of the things that we're going to get into today is how hepatic biotransformation, how dendritic cell tolerance, how Treg cell function, how microbiome diversity, how all these other factors determine whether you react to a food or have food sensitivities or food reactions, and same with your patient population, right? That's a little too much. Okay. Anyways, so let's move on to the first slide. So this was an interesting paper in 2015. It was a review article. But the summary and conclusion of this paper was that estimated 1/5 of the population believed to have some type of adverse reaction to food. So not all of these are classical allergy, but these are food reactions. And I guess when you look at food reactions, it's a whole spectrum of things. Some food reactions can directly cause autoimmune attacks based on genotype, autoimmune specificity, specific antibody production. Some food sensitivities will cause severe inflammation. Some food sensitivities will cause changes in behavior. The whole list of spectrum of things that we get to see. So here's what I need to do. I need to go into a bunch of slides that eventually get into the exact mechanism of what they understand about oral tolerance or dietary protein tolerance. But in order to do that, I need to review the immune system with you first and how things work, okay? So I'm going to show you guys a little video animation. It's about, about a minute long. And it shows you the immune steps that are taking place when your gut macrophages, called dendritic cells, get exposed to food, okay? Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to replay the video after you've seen it once and stop it to kind of explain some of the key concepts for you. So when you look at the slides I'm about to show you later on as we move on, the mechanisms and how they flow together start to make more sense. Okay? Now, what you have to first understand is that when you eat any kind of protein, so as you're eating your salads and chicken and all the things that are on there, those things are going to eventually end up in your gut. And then these peptides are eventually going to be broken down into smaller peptides and eventually amino acids. But as peptide forms, they're going to interact with your gut mucosa. And on your gut mucosa, you have macrophages in the gut called dendritic cells. And then these dendritic cells are going to basically wrap around it and start to sample it. And then they'll determine what kind of reaction you'll have by communicating with other immune cells. Okay? So in this video, you're going to see, the initial thing you'll see is a dendritic cell responding, which is what will happen when you sample food in your gut with these cells, what happens when you sample food in the gut with cells. And then eventually you'll see all the way into antibody production and then histamine responses. Okay, so let me show you that, and we'll go from there. first thing you're going to see is they have this cell called the antigen-presenting cell, this large spidery kind of thing on the left, right? This has these branches, and what these branches do is as soon as they sense protein in the gut, they reach out to them and then eventually they engulf them. That's the initial step. Those are what dendritic cells do. So part of the research you guys are going to see as I show you the slides, they're finding that how tolerant your dendritic cells are determine how much reactivity you have to food. So what they're finding that people that have autoimmune diseases, people that have multiple reactions to foods, these dendritic cells are responding abnormally. They're responding way too aggressively, okay? Now, these dendritic cells can be dysregulated with things like vitamin A deficiencies and vitamin D deficiencies and lack of SIGA and stress responses and various things. So we'll go over the list of things as we go through each step, but these are really one of the key fundamental cells you have to understand when it comes to identifying what the defect is in someone's oral tolerance or their ability to react to food. So let me move on from here. The dendritic cell, called the APC, antigen-presenting cell, is then telling a effector T cell, these are T cells that have short lifespan, and then they're going to go in there and stimulate a Th2 cell. So Th2 cells involved with the antibody production pathway of the immune response, right? And these Th2 cells are then going to stimulate B cells to make antibodies. So what you guys will see is these B cells that are on the side, that are purple, they're going to start producing this Y-shaped thing, which is an antibody, and this reaction is going to develop the immune response to food, okay? Now you see one of the most critical cells under the picture. It's called the Treg cell. You guys see that yellow cell there? This is probably the single most important cell for autoimmune disease, food intolerances, chemical intolerances. Your Treg cells dampen the immune response. They give a normal proportional response to how much reactivity you should have to a chemical, to an antigen, to a food. People that have chronic food sensitivities, people that have autoimmunity, they have inefficient Treg cells. They're trying to build drugs to activate Treg cells. Now, nutrients to activate Treg cells, we'll give you the list as we move on. And there's things that dysregulate them, like stress and chemicals. And there's things that activate them in lifestyle. And major things are, for example, exercise. If you release opioids in your body, you activate Treg cells, which is what you want. So if you have an autoimmune disease and you're laughing all the time and you're exercising and get an opioid high, you'll probably have better tolerance, right? People that have good relationships, people that have reasons to have opioid release throughout the day, will tend to have better tolerance. Now, what if a patient comes in and they say, "Oh, I hate this disease. I hate you. I hate your office. I hate your carpet. I hate your front staff person. I hate the supplement. I hate it all." Probably not getting opioid responses throughout the day, right? So those things do make a difference in autoimmune disease. I know when I screen patients, I always kind of look at their histories as questions I ask them. And I know when you see that completely negative person, it's very, very hard to turn around despite any kind of supplements, right? So these psychoneuroimmune effects take place and they impact cells like Treg cells, okay? The point is this though. We saw so far dendritic cell response, right? Key player in the immune tolerance pathway. Then these dendritic cells started to trigger a response, and then these Treg cells came in. And these Treg cells we're going to talk a lot about, but they come in, what you'll see is they'll shut down this antibody and Th2 response. So they shut it down. And these Y-shaped things coming out are antibodies. So what you're seeing is these antibodies are attaching to a mast cell, and these green things being released are histamine, okay? So that's the concept. Now, there's different parts of this. These antibodies also attach to the protein, and here's a key thing you have to understand. Antibodies don't destroy anything. Antibodies attach to mast cells to release histamine. Antibodies attach to proteins, and when they attach to that protein, T cells and natural killer cells will then come in and destroy it. So whatever your immune system tags with an antibody, will then be a target site for natural killer cells and T cells throughout the body. Okay? This is why sometimes you'll see people that have really, really high antibodies for something, but their reaction isn't as severe. And someone could have a trace level antibody count, but they have severe reactions. Because it's not the antibody alone that determines how much immune destruction you get or immune inflammation you get. It's the T cells also. So for example, if someone has very, very high antibodies, but a very weak T cell and natural killer cell attack against those targeted proteins, there's not much reaction. If someone has very slight elevation of antibodies, but their T cell natural killer response is very aggressive, then they could be in bad shape. And that could apply to foods. That could apply to autoimmunity. If someone has, let's say, for example, thyroid antibodies, 10,000, way off the chart, compared to someone who's got 300, it doesn't tell you how severe their autoimmune attack is, because their T cells are part of the picture you're not seeing. Does that make sense? Okay. So at the end of the day, when you look at this diagram, you see dendritic cells come in, or they're the first player in this video. So they're in your gut, they're waiting for food peptides to come in. Everything you ate is going to encounter a dendritic cell before the end of the lecture. Okay. Those dendritic cells are going to sample your salad and whatever you just ate. And then it's going to then, here's what's going to happen. These dendritic cells are then going to go into your gut lining lymph system. They're going to go through your Peyer's patches to your mesenteric lymph nodes. And living in your mesenteric lymph nodes are T cells and B cells and natural killer cells. And they're going, hey, what do you got? And then they're going to sample it. And your T cells are going to immediately respond, and your B cells are going to immediately respond. But your Treg cells will tell them how aggressive they should respond. Okay? And then they'll have a reaction, and the B cells will then circulate to the area and make sure they're listening, suppress their activity, right? And then you have a response. So if you have dendritic cells that are really, really overactive, you have Treg cells that are failing, you have massive release of histamine from mast cells, you get an inflammatory immune response, okay? Now, there's two parts of the inflammatory immune response with food reactivity. One of it is through mast cell release of histamine, and another part of this is just antibodies attaching to protein causing an inflammatory reaction, which is not illustrated in this video. Okay, it's just the histamine pathway. So that's the key thing. Now, the other thing about reactions to food, why are they different from one person to the next? Well, why does someone have a food sensitivity and all of a sudden they have joint inflammation when they eat the food, and someone else eats foods and they have migraine, someone else eats the foods and they have emotional changes and so forth? Well, it depends on what their pre-existing state is. So let's talk about histamine for a second. So when your mast cells release histamine for a food response, histamine has different effects throughout your body because you have different histamine receptors. So you have H1, H2, H3, H4, you have 4 different types of histamine receptors. You have different histamine receptors in your brain than you do in your blood vessels, than you do in your smooth muscles. So histamine gets released, and you already have very high activity and excitatory pathways in your brain, and you're already kind of close to edge on having anxiety responses. You get a food reaction that histamine activates those excitatory pathways, and those receptors are already close to threshold, so now you get anxiety. Okay? Someone else already has some issues with their vascular tone in their arteries. Their serotonin, nitric oxide, vascular growth factor, balance integration between the blood vessels are different. So they get a little bit of histamine exposure in those receptor blood vessels, and now they get a massive migraine. Right? Where their reactions happen kind of tells you what else is going with their patient. Someone else has a little bit of rheumatoid arthritis, hasn't progressed yet. They eat some foods and their joints really, really hurt. Okay? So you can kind of see when people get exposed to food, what kind of reactions they have. It kind of lets you know what their pre-existing state is, so it allows you to dig deeper when you see something, right? Now, besides histamine, what's also being triggered when you see these immune responses to foods, you actually have T cells releasing inflammatory cytokines, right? So you activate things like TNF-alpha, interleukin-1, interleukin-2, the old Th1 side too, and they create systemic inflammation throughout the body. We'll talk about how they cause peripheral manifestations from the gut, but we'll get into that later. Okay, so that's the basic diagram. Now, there was a paper published in 2014, the Journal of Nutrition, and it went on to say, basically, I'm not going to read the slides to you, but I just want you to understand the concept. They go on and say, listen, this diet we have in the US is really promoting major changes in our immune tolerance, dysfunctioning Treg cells, the fact we have overconsumption of foods, the fact we have new food proteins, the fact we have diets lacking of vital nutrients, we have diets deficient in fatty acids. And then the research paper had this beautiful diagram that kind of summarized everything. So these researchers did a great review paper, and they go, you know, the bottom line is we have an inflamed gut. And just so you guys know, inflamed guts happen when you lose your dietary protein tolerance, right? So you start to react to food, your gut gets inflamed. But if you have an inflamed gut just to begin with, you lose your tolerance further. So they kind of, it's like a vicious cycle. Now, we know that Th17, which is an inflammatory pathway for food protein reactions and autoimmunity, is definitely amplified with salt intake. Okay? So high salt intakes promote greater T-cell inflammatory reactions. It's a major research showing now that salt restriction dampens autoimmune reactions, and salt intake that's excessive tends to promote this. We know that new wheat proteins like gluten, lack of good essential fatty acids in diet, too much saturated fats, artificial flavors, lack of phytonutrients, these things cause dysbiosis and gut inflammation, and these things disrupt regulatory T cells. And if you disrupt regulatory T cells, you lose your tolerance. Okay? Now, tolerance, there's different types. There is chemical tolerance, meaning your ability to react or not react to chemicals. So if a person all of a sudden starts to react to gasoline fumes and they put on something on their skin like a lotion and they start to react against that, and they react against a shampoo and they can't tolerate, you know, someone in the elevator with perfume on, they're losing what's called chemical tolerance. And that can develop into multiple chemical sensitivity. Another form of tolerance, besides food, is self-tolerance. You have to be able, your immune system has to tolerate your own cells. And if it doesn't tolerate them, then you get an autoimmune disease. So that's called loss of self-tolerance. Okay? We're focused today on loss of dietary protein tolerance, which is also known as oral tolerance. Okay? Now, Treg dysfunction impacts all of them, just so you know. So you're expecting people that have lost their dietary protein tolerance to pretty much develop into autoimmunity, because they're going to lose their self-tolerance and even lose their chemical tolerance, right? So when a person notices that they're becoming more and more reactive to foods, they're going the wrong way. It's the same immunological mechanisms for leading into autoimmunity, leading into chemical sensitivity. Does that make sense? So it's a red flag. Now, some of you may have noticed you've become more reactive with foods over time. That means you're losing some of your tolerance, right? Or your family members, right? Now we have kids born with already impaired tolerance, so they're born and they're immediately having eczema and skin rashes, and they're having developmental delays in their brain because of the chronic inflammation and other mechanisms. Those are happening now to kids very, very early, like not when we were, let's say, younger and in school and so forth. But it's becoming a serious problem. So we know one part of this is the diet. Now, why is this important? Because, you guys, the world of nutrition is somehow still stuck in, like, what's your nutrient requirements you need? What are your RDA guidelines? Not necessarily us, but the rest of the world. And you guys know that those guidelines were for World War II soldiers in combat, so they don't become severely nutritionally deprived and couldn't fight in combat. Okay? But the real issue is we have exposure to a whole list of foods and chemicals like never before, right? You guys, organic is not as organic as you think. Most organic foods and studies have shown are loaded with pesticides because of rainwater, because of the soil that they're into. So we have chemicals and pesticides binding to them. We have new proteins, right? We have hybridized proteins. We have GMOs. We have all these things that are impacting our immune tolerance. And what they're actually finding too is that chemicals impact our tolerance. Like BPA is one of these ones, where they gave perinatal exposure to BPA, and they found the offspring ended up with loss of dietary protein tolerance and food sensitivities later. So BPA, you guys in plastics. You guys are drinking out of plastic bottles, you're getting BPA levels. So BPA, just so you guys know, there's a study published that showed 99% of people tested in the US have extraordinary high BPA levels. BPA is a xenoestrogen. BPA is an immune trigger. It's very, very scary. So all this plastic exposures, even if you eat really healthy, but you go and get your organic, fantastic salad from Whole Foods in your plastic container, and then you use your plastic spoon and you drink your plastic, bottle filled with coconut water, whatever you're doing. And you get your sales receipt loaded with BPA on the receipt, ink, and you put it in, and then maybe you heat your food in the plastic, and now you're getting all this BPA exposure going, but I'm eating really well. Yeah, but you just got a huge chemical exposure. And then you finish off your lunch and you go get a tea or a coffee, and then you drink through the lid, and you get all that BPA exposure because the heat releases BPA. This is happening. One study that was recently published found fire retardants were elevated in 96% of women throughout the United States, and they checked all 50 states. Fire retardants are found in furniture. All furnitures are sprayed with it. Pajamas and kids are sprayed with it. You know, many manufactured clothes spray it as a safety thing. So we're getting these chemicals in our environment unrelated to the foods we choose to eat. These things are all impacting tolerance. Does that make sense? And some people are more sensitive than others for various reasons. So this is a diagram just to kind of bring this concept up. Things like pesticides, chemicals, modern diet, hybridization of seeds, making seeds strains different so they can resist weather changes and bugs not eating them, GMO foods, food processing, and even some genetic susceptibility increases the risk of both allergy and food sensitivity, okay? Now, obviously, we're seeing more food sensitivity than we are seeing allergy, but food sensitivity, the key thing about it is that it causes diverse reactions because it causes an inflammatory reaction throughout the body, and whatever is susceptible then starts to show up, right? So what things show up is really, really important. And one of the major things people have with food reactions is just fatigue, because inflammation uncouples the mitochondria, so they don't produce as much energy in their cells. Most people that have a significant food reaction, first thing they notice when they go off it is what? They feel energized. They feel like they got a bump of energy back, because the inflammation uncouples mitochondria, so as they remove that, they can make more efficient ATP. So whether it's depression or brain fog or, you know, flare-ups of their autoimmune disease, whatever it may be, we know that food sensitivities can potentially cause those factors. Okay, so I'm going to go over 11 key concepts with you today in 3 categories. Okay, in the past 2 years, I've been able to work with one of my major teachers, mentors, Rachelle. He's, as you guys know, a PhD immunologist, one of the main research on autoimmune disease. And I've been able to do some research, and we've been able to publish some research together and work in his lab. So I've learned a lot of great things about food sensitivity testing. And if you guys don't know Rachelle, he was the first person to do food allergy testing. When he was doing his postdoc at UCLA and the ELISA methodology first came out, he was the guy who started doing it and publishing on it. So he's kind of like the father of food allergy testing. Well, he's published some major areas of research in what types of food reactions happen and factors involved with that. So I'm going to share with you some of the research and some of the things I've learned with him, okay? The first thing I want to cover with you guys, though, is antigenic factors. The concept of cooked food versus raw food and food combining and combination of proteins together, what does that really show? Because there's some real-life applications to food immune responses. And you also have to understand what you're seeing when you're looking at a food sensitivity panel. Whether you're looking at a cell-mediated test or an antibody test, or patients come in with stacks of lab work and they've had multiple foods tested, whether some of them reliable or is they not reliable, what are the factors involved? Okay, I mean, that's what we all face in clinical practice. This is, by the way, this is Dr. Bijdani. Many of you guys know him. He's the chief scientific scientist for Cyrex Labs, and we're going to go over a lot of the great things that he's presented. Okay, so here's a first key concept. Antigenicity of food protein can be altered when combined or denatured from heating. Some patients will react differently to raw versus cooked food. When you cook food, you change the protein. You change the antigenic activity. Okay? Now, all commercial labs, except Cyrex, use raw protein. They don't use cooked. So you could have a person come in and not show up for eggs because they checked it in raw form, but who's eating raw eggs every day? Unless you're like Rocky, like making a shake or something. You know? You're usually eating cooked eggs. So those things can make a difference. So look at this paper in the title here. Rare, medium, or well done. The effect of heating on food matrix on food protein allergenicity, and then effective food processing integrity of protein epitopes. Epitopes are target sites for antibodies. And heating and other methods of food processing have different effects on food allergens, even those contained in the same complex food. So when you guys look at food proteins, they're a peptide structure that's all intertwined with each other. And what you'll see is heating can actually change this. So let me show you this really great video that illustrates this. So this is food being cooked. And then if you look at the peptide structure of a dietary protein, as it gets heated, the actual structure will start to change, and those structures changing create different antigenic target sites for different antibody and immune responses. That's what heating does. You could have a patient react to cooked food or raw food differently. Okay, so that's the first really important concept. This is a great picture. Take a look at an egg, and the protein changes alone, the color changes, the structural changes from 2 minutes to 3 minutes to 1 hour to 4 hours to 10 hours. Okay? So it's not the same antigen. Because you literally could have a patient react to food differently by how much the protein is denatured through cooking. Okay? So this was a study that was published, and it was in 2009, and the detection of antibodies against raw and processed food antigens. And take a look over here on the right-hand side, you guys will see eggs. So they checked 160 individuals, and of those 160 individuals, 23 of them reacted to raw egg, whereas 139 reacted to cooked egg. Huge difference. Okay? So here's a scenario. You have a patient who's really, really sick, they're really, really inflamed, they come in, they go, I did a food sensitivity test, and my egg response was normal, so I think an egg's right? I can eat eggs? Oh, yeah, okay. And what happened? What was the lab checking? Raw. Because unless it says cooked, it's raw. Unless the lab specifically writes cooked, it's raw. And this is why Dr. Vajtani, running Cyrix, he had to make his panels with cooked and raw for foods people eat, because he knew as an immunologist and research he's published, and other people have published, that it's a completely different protein. So when you have food, when you guys look at a patient's food sensitivity panel, maybe the ones that they brought in, if you guys see raw, that doesn't necessarily mean that that was accurate, because that's not really what they're eating. So look at the foods and see what form they're actually eating it in, and then assume that everything the lab tests you may see from other labs are actually raw. Everybody okay with that? Okay. And then they found the same thing. Look at this, raw bacon. Who eats raw bacon? But it could be on a food sensitivity panel, and that's how they test in a raw form. Only 17 people reacted, but 118 people, 10 times the amount of people reacted to it was actually in the form that people eat. And you go down the list and you see this trend. So some foods become more antigenic when they're cooked, some become more antigenic in a raw form, and it's unique for each individual. Someone can eat like cooked salmon, have no problem, but have sashimi and have a reaction to it. So what you have to first understand as a clinical concept, looking at food sensitivities, is raw and cooked are different antigens. Okay? Now, here's another key concept. Antigenicity of individual food protein can be altered when combined with another food protein. Real-world combining of foods should be considered when interpreting food test results. So in a real-world setting, we have a limitation with all food sensitivity testing because they're testing one protein at a time. But when you combine proteins and cook them together, you can have a different antigen. So you need to know that as a clinician, so you don't put all of your weight on a test, that you know some other factors that can influence your clinical response with your patients. So this was a study that was published in Nutrition and Metabolism, and look at what they did here. Let's say we take a look at this row here. So they took wheat, milk, tomato, cheese, mushrooms, and they checked in individually, and they saw some reactions. But then they took pizza, all cooked together, all these ingredients cooked together, and there was severe reactions. Okay. And basically how they do food antibody testing is they take a food, they mix it in a blender, they grind it up into a liquid purified form, they stick it to an ELISA plate, and then they incubate it, and the protein sticks to the gel, and then they take a person's blood, and they see if there's an interaction there. If there is, there's an antibody binding. So when they took pizza and grinded that up into a liquid form, it was completely different than each of the individual ingredients. Okay? So we have to consider that sometimes our patients may report things that are different because of real-life food combining. Now, how do you know? You don't know. You just know that's a clinical factor that occurred with some people. Because you can have a person go in and go, I tested negative against all these individual foods, but they ordered a meal at a restaurant where all those foods were technically okay, but when they actually had them all cooked together, they had a strong reaction to it. Now, what's going to determine if they have reactions at all to foods? Their overall tolerance. So at the end of the day, we're still trying to improve oral tolerance with people, but we have to understand the limitations and the things that we see with certain types of testing alone, right? And testing is very useful in different contexts too, but we need to know strengths and limitations of at food sensitivity testing. Okay, so those are things that are related to antigenic factors that I thought are really critical that we should definitely make sure you're comfortable with. Let's move on to a new category called food cross-reactivity or food protein cross-reactivity. So here's a key concept. Dietary proteins that share a similar amino acid sequence homology, meaning they have a chain of amino acids identical from food to self-tissue protein, with human tissue proteins can induce antigen-antibody reactions or immunological cross-reactivity. So what this is saying is that if you look at, for example, a chain of amino acid sequences. So here you have gliadin, which is wheat protein, right? Gliadin peptide. And this is the amino acid sequence. You guys see it? E, Q, V, P, L, V, right? Q. Now take a look at cerebellar tissue underneath it. What do you see? E, V, P, L. You guys see that similarity? So when you see that similarity, there's a concept that's possible called cross-reactivity. So a person could have sensitivity to gliadin peptide, and they make antibodies to gliadin when they get exposed to it. These antibodies are going to attach to gliadin and break it down immediately, but these antibodies can now also bind to cerebellar tissue. And when an antibody attaches to a tissue, what does that mean? That means T cells and natural killer cells have to go destroy it. Okay? So this is a mechanism that's known as gluten ataxia. They know that people that have severe gluten sensitivity, when they get exposed, they can have cerebellar degeneration, and they get ataxia. Have you guys ever seen gluten ataxia patients? Do you guys know you all have gluten ataxia patients in your office? So let me tell you how to quickly find them and screen for testing. So most people who have gluten ataxia have what's a form of ataxia called idiopathic sporadic ataxia. Idiopathic sporadic ataxia means they have, first of all, ataxia. So what's ataxia? It means they're all over the place. You can't see it when they walk. You actually have to do a test to check for ataxia. So you have a patient walk in a straight line, heel toe, like they're walking on a balance beam, right? They should be able to walk across the room in a straight line with their eyes closed. If they can't take 3 full steps, they have ataxia. So they're walking in a straight line and they're falling, if they fall all over the place and they can't do it, that's ataxia. If you see them shaking, they're on a boat, that's ataxia. So the research shows if they have ataxia and there's no known cause, there's no recent head trauma, they don't have MS, they don't have a neurological disease, they don't know why the person has that, that's called idiopathic. And if it's sporadic, means it comes and goes, it's worse and better different days, that's idiopathic sporadic ataxia. And some papers published show 60% of people that have idiopathic sporadic ataxia have gluten sensitivity as a cause. That it's this cross-reactivity. How many people in your office have gluten sensitivity? A lot of them. You should check for ataxia. It's one of the most common clinical manifestations. One paper was published that showed 80 to 90% of people that have gluten ataxia have no GI manifestations. There's no gut symptoms. Okay? So this is another concept of food sensitivity. Certain foods have the potential to cross-react with self-tissue. And this is really scary stuff, because you can actually have those antibodies attack your own tissue and cause a destructive process. Now, in a laboratory, you can see this look like this. So this is one form of testing called dot blot immunodetection. So let me show you what we're seeing here. You have two rows of wells. This well here, these 2 wells are gliadin peptide. That's purified gluten protein. This is gliadin crude. It's not purified. It's just wheat with all the other things in it. This is cerebellar protein attached to these wells. This is myelin basic protein. This is egg, and this is soy. So what the lab is with these, what's done in this study is they take these individual proteins, they put it on a ELISA plate, and then what they've done on the top is they've taken a person's blood with cerebellar antibodies and exposed them to the proteins attached to these wells, and then taken someone who has gliadin antibodies and attached them to these wells. Okay? Now take a look at here. If you take antigen and antibody and mix them together, what should happen? They should react and stick together, and then you see the color change. So if you see this well here, which is cerebellar protein, and they mix it with cerebellar antibodies, what do you see? You see a reaction. That's what you would expect. Okay? But look what happens when they take cerebellar antibodies and mix it with gliadin peptide. It also reacts. That's molecular mimicry. Okay, that's cross-reactivity. So this makes food sensitivity really, really dangerous or a real clinical concern for some people. You know, like, let's say, give you an example. Someone comes in your office and goes, yeah, you know, my sister actually got diagnosed with celiac disease. I think I'm okay with gluten. I'm not sure. Why are you here? Well, I have brain fog. I get some vertigo. I feel tired. Okay, try to walk in a straight line. And they'll say they fall all over the place. But you know, I'm mostly gluten-free. Do you think it's really that bad? Like, you can test if she had cerebellar, you can test cerebellar antibodies. If she has cerebellar antibodies and gluten reactions, it's like, you can't even look at gluten. You can't even think about it. I mean, that's how serious this is. If you see some around, look away, just in case it might infect your brain. Don't know. You can't be around it. So some of these food sensitivities can be very, very dangerous. And yeah, this is what that looks like on imaging. This was a case report published in 2002. This is a brain MRI of a patient with gluten ataxia showing rapid onset of cerebellar atrophy over 15 months. So if you take a look at this, you guys see these white matter lesions in there? You guys see that in the cerebellum? This person didn't know they had gluten sensitivity as the cause. They kept eating it, and in 15 months, this lesion progressed into that. So this is a very aggressive case study example. So not all of them are that serious, but you can see it's actually destroying that tissue. That protein exposure can attach to those antigens and cause that tissue destruction. So one important concept of understanding food sensitivities is not just that it's a reaction to food, but some of these antibodies can potentially bind to other tissue and then cause their own set of problems. Everybody okay with that? Okay. Now, here's a study we published 2 years ago. The prevalence of antibodies against wheat and milk proteins and blood donors and their contributions to neuroimmune reactivities. If you guys want the full paper, just to type in my name in PubMed, you can get access to it. It's available for free. But we took 400 healthy blood donor samples, and we checked them for antibodies to gamma-gliadin, omega-gliadin, transglutaminase, all the different epitopes of wheat. And we also checked them against myelin-associated protein and myelooligodendrocyte protein and cerebellar proteins. Now, research shows that only 1%, current research is showing only 1% of people have celiac disease, and only a small percentage of them have reactions to wheat. That's what they say. So what we found in our study with healthy blood donors, not knowing the random healthy blood donors, is when you look at the antibodies, between 8 to 12% of people had antibodies to milk or wheat. Okay? So more than just 1% with celiac, but just these are not the same thing, but at least immune reaction to those proteins. So then what we did is we took those people that reacted to milk and wheat, and we checked to see if they had neurological autoimmunities. Guess what? Half of them had neurological autoimmunities. Then we don't know if that was actually accurate or not, so we did, statistical analysis, Pearson's and chi-square analysis, logistic regression, and we found without a question of doubt, this is not beyond chance. This is very, very p-value less than 0.001. This is significantly correlative. If you have these antibodies, there's a very strong probability that you will get these immune reactions. And then when we look at what we'll call R values, which are how one-to-one relationships means you have 100% interaction, these R values are like in the 80%, 70%, which means it's very, very serious. These are not celiac disease people. These are just people that's out there. So this cross-reactivity pattern is more prevalent than we really think, right? And this is where things get scary when you look how important food sensitivities can be. I'm going to show you guys a video case of a patient. And what you guys are going to see is, first of all, you see pupils, and obviously the first thing you see is one pupil is in different size than the other. That's not what I want you to look at. What I want you to look at is we're going to check their pupil response to light. So what should happen to pupils in darkness? They should dilate. And what happens when you shine light in the eyes? Constrict. Okay, so we're just looking to see if they respond to light. Okay? Now, this person is wearing these goggles, and they're looking straight, and I'm turning the lights on and off to stimulate both eyes at the same time. Okay, and you guys will hear it clicking when you hear the lights turn on and off. Just look at the pupil responses in this individual. Do you guys see any constriction or dilation happening? These are non-responsive pupils. So what does the clinical sign up? Yes, this is neuromyelitis optica. This is neuritis. This is inflammation nerve. This is autoimmune. This is potentially MS. but it's not. It's neuromyelitis optica in this case. It's an autoimmune disease where it attacks neurological tissue receptors called aquaporin, and that's what this person's suffering from. They get blurry vision and diverse neurological symptoms. Okay? Now, do you think milk and wheat may be good for this person? So would you be like, hey, maybe we should investigate if you have milk or wheat antibodies, because we know those can potentially cross-react with synapsin, myelin, cerebellar tissue. That'd be a good thing to check, right? But here's the thing with this patient, 100% gluten-free. Okay? Now, what's interesting is this is a target site for neuromyelitis optica is actually a protein called aquaporin. It's a water channel receptor, and when it gets attacked, people end up having this neuromyelitis optica as one of the expressions because there are lots of aquaporin receptors throughout the optic nerve pathways. Okay? It impacts the rest of their system. So what I want you to know is think about this. Could any other foods besides milk and wheat potentially cause this reaction? If they have what? If they have molecular mimicry, there's a risk for another food protein that can cross-react with aquaporin to potentially cause reactions there. So take a look at foods that contain aquaporin chains. Look at human aquaporin, that's the antibody target site for neuromyelitis optica. And now look at soy. Look at corn, look at spinach, and look at tomato. What do you think? Is it possible? It's possible. There's a molecular mimicry sequence chain, so if this person eats soy, corn, spinach, or tomato, and they make antibodies, these antibodies can actually bind to their autoimmune target site, and then the antibodies bind to that tissue, what happens? T cells and natural killer cells destroy it. You have a dietary protein-induced autoimmunity as part of the chain of the other things that are involved. But it's another trigger to it. Do you guys understand? So this is how serious food sensitivities can get. And we published this paper, Detection of Antibodies Against Human and Plant Aquaporins in Patients with Multiple Sclerosis, where we're looking at these cross-reactive chains with these different food proteins, okay? So here's the thing. These food proteins cause molecular mimicry, they can cause a reaction there. So if that patient you guys saw with no people response, how is this autoimmune, paleo, gluten, dairy-free lunch? Well, you see corn, you see spinach, you see tomato. This looks like your salad. Now, is it a problem if you eat it? Will you guys having similar foods have it? No, because here's what has to happen for cross-reactivity. Number one, you have to make high amounts of antibodies. And two, you have to have that target site already lose self-tolerance. So you guys understand this cascade? So let me explain this one more time. Just because someone eats spinach, corn, or tomato doesn't mean they have these reactions, right? Just because someone eats gluten doesn't mean they have these reactions. What has to happen first is a person loses self-tolerance to that tissue. So they make antibodies against their myelin, they make antibodies against their cerebellum, they make antibodies to aquaporin receptors, number one. Second, then they produce an antibody for a food that can attach to it. But that combination is devastating. Okay, so what we're learning, and what's been published in the literature in the immunology field, is food cross-reactivity can be a very serious issue with various autoimmune diseases. Now, the unfortunate thing is we don't have all these other autoimmune diseases research. Most of the research right now is on wheat and milk causing neurological autoimmunity. Okay, our publication Aquaporin related with aquaporin receptors, and there's some research on milk and wheat also causing islet cell pancreatic cross-reactivity for type 1 diabetics. Okay? Now, wouldn't it be cool if we had one for the thyroid? Because Hashimoto's is the #1 autoimmune disease, in the world. So one of the things that we did is we did a research study that we just submitted to publication, but we checked for cross-reactivity with 210 foods with TSH receptor, T4, T3, thyroglobulin, TPO, and 5-deiodinase. Okay? And one of the things so here we are, this is in the lab, we're preparing these, and I just want you to get an idea how this works. You see this amino acid sequence? That's TPO. So then you have to figure out what the target sites are for immune reactivity. And that's what you see colored like 1 through 22, right? And then those could be potential target sites. And then you have to make antibodies that are identical to those immune reactions. Those are called monoclonal antibodies. And then you mix it with pure antigen, and then you see if they stick together. So we took those target sites. We then took these foods, 210 foods, and then we had monoclonal antibodies produced by a specialty immunology lab. Monoclonal antibodies, I don't know if you guys are familiar with them. Monoclonal and some polyclonal. They inject an animal with the antigen. The animal makes the antibody. The antibody is made by a cell in the spleen. They identify the cell. They then replicate those antibodies, and you have pure antibody that should attach to nothing else except that pure antigen. So then we take 220 foods and we purify them, which means we put them through basically dialysis. So everything except protein is eliminated. We had pure protein, pure monoclonal antibody. So what happens if you combine them? If there's cross-reactivity, you see an interaction, okay? And then monoclonal antibody, you guys see these little things like that? Just so you understand, like a monoclonal antibody just to like TPO could cost $10,000 for like a dime-sized shape. So you don't want to spill anything. So you can see it gets really expensive to do cross-reactive research, especially when you're self-funding and trying to figure out this stuff. But it's important to know because we have a lot of people that need these answers. So what you do in these studies, you take pure antigens, you put them on a dish, pure food proteins. You take the monoclonal antibody, you attach it, you take a dye, and the dye is a fluorescent dye, and if you have an antigen-antibody complex with pure protein and pure monoclonal antibody, the reaction turns a different color. And that's how you know you have molecular mimicry. Does that make sense? Okay. So, here's a question for you. I won't show you the results, but think of this. How are these nutrient-rich, organic, gluten-free, dairy-free food choices for a Hashimoto's patient? Looks okay, right? How about this? A little salad, a little latex glove. So what we found, I can't give you all the results because we have to wait for the results to be published, but I'll only share a couple of them with you. And here's what we're going to do. I think what we're going to do, there's been so much research we've figured out and done with the thyroid. We'll probably in the future do a 2-hour with all this because we've done cross-reactivity for our thyroid for all the foods, all the major chemicals, and other cross-reactive tissue target sites. So as those get published, we'll turn that into a 2-hour, and then we'll give you all the recent details and updates on hypothyroidism and autoimmunity. So stick with our seminar series. We have that coming out in the future. But what we found is people had cross-reactivity with thyroglobulin and latex. So what happens if they eat a salad and they prepare food and the person was using latex gloves? Yes, they get a trigger. They get a cross-reactive trigger. So if they have thyroglobulin antibodies, which most Hashimoto's people do, and they get exposed to latex, those antibodies against latex can attach to thyroglobulin and perpetuate their autoimmune disease. Look what else showed up. Tuna, cooked and raw. Tuna's good, right? It's got iodine, it's good for you. And, no antigens, gluten, dairy-free. Get some sashimi, get your fatty acids. Now for people that have autoimmunity to T4, they have tuna antibodies, that's the key thing. They have the target site, and then they have the antibody exposure with foods. This can be a devastating response. You guys understand that? So, I'll be honest with you. For me, when I looked at food sensitivities, I used to think, they don't really matter. People have them, so what? Just fix their leaky gut. Now I'm learning, oh my gosh, these are really can be serious for some people, especially those that already have some type of autoimmunity. Okay? So we've actually mapped out the molecular mimicry target sites for the thyroid, for the cerebellum, because we found more than gluten causes gluten ataxia, and type 1 diabetes, pancreatic islet site, target sites. Okay? So again, we'll share that with you as we get it published. Now, here's the thing. You guys understand the concept of foods with self-tissue, but let me go over another concept. Have you guys ever had a patient come in, you do a food sensitivity test, and the test results show, for example, that they tested against shrimp and scallop, and they say, well, I never eat scallops. I hate scallops. Scallops make me want to throw up. I would never touch that. How could I have antibodies against it? I don't eat it. This has got to be abnormal test results. This lab has got to be doing the wrong things, or it's contaminated, or this is fishy. I don't believe these results. Well, the reality is that foods can also cross-react with each other. So if you have an antibody reaction against one food, you may show up on a test and have immune reaction against another food because of the structural similarity, okay? So a food-protein cross-reactivity versus cell-tissue cross-reactivity, here's the key concept. If the immune reaction to a particular food protein shares a similar sequence of amino acids to another food protein, these patients may test positive lab results if the patient is no longer consuming the food due to protein sequence cross-reactivity. So let's say, for example, you have consumed food, non-consumed food, and this consumed food is shrimp. Let's say they have shrimp reactions, immunological antibodies produced to shrimps, okay? But then they eat scallops, but scallops have a similar amino acid sequence, so what's gonna show up in the lab test? Because basically what the lab is doing, they're putting all these different proteins on a well, they're taking the patient's blood, which is all the diverse list of antibodies, and if they have a reaction to the food, and you guys understand, reactions to foods aren't reactions to foods. Reactions to foods are actually reactions to a amino acid sequence. So if the amino acid sequence of shrimp is very similar to the amino acid sequence of scallop, they'll test positive for it. Okay? Now, there was a great paper published in the Journal of Allergy and Clinical Immunology. This is one of the most referenced papers out there on this topic. And there was a review paper, and this author went through and reviewed all the literature, and this is what they found. So, for example, if a person has sensitivity to shellfish, 75% of them will have other shellfish food sensitivities because of amino acid sequence similarity. If someone has a reaction to cow's milk, 92% of them will have reactions to goat's milk because of amino acid sequence similarity. Does that make sense? Okay. So a lot of times you have to, well, let me put it this way. What you have to understand is that when you have an immune response to a food, it's not a food. It's an amino acid sequence. And other foods that share that amino acid sequence, you start to have also immune reactions to, and those are reflected in lab tests that are done with your patient's blood. So if your patient only ate shrimp and never ate scallops, and they submit it in and it shows scallops are positive, if they ate scallops, well, even though they haven't been, they're going to have an immune reaction to it because they're reacting to the amino acid sequence that's there. Does that make sense with everybody? Okay. So those are the key concepts related to food-protein cross-reactivity. So here's what we've done so far. I just want to make sure you guys, you have the same vision I have presenting this material. We're talking about food sensitivities. We talked about antigenic factors, cooked versus raw, combining foods. We talked about the concept of cross-reactivity to self-tissue in autoimmune cases, and then cross-reactivity with other proteins. You guys are okay with that? So now the question is, well, what do you do about it? What do we do as clinicians? These things exist, but what do you do? Why do some people have food sensitivities, and what are the mechanisms, and how do we support that? So let's get into the next section here, which is immune tolerance factors. And immune tolerance factors include permeability, T cell function, gut microbiome diversity, protein breakdown, dendritic cell responses, hepatopoietic transformation. And here's what I'm going to do as we go on. I'm going to completely dissect the pathway immunologically for you, and then I'm going to insert which nutritional compounds have been shown to impact each one of these. And then I'll give you guys a protocol we use for people trying to improve their dietary tolerance. Because what we found is going after leaky gut alone by itself isn't working for a lot of people, that we have to look at the other spectrum of factors that impact a person's reaction to foods. Does that make sense? Okay. So here's, the key concept. Failure to induce tolerance to food protein is thought to result in food allergy, celiac disease, also second pathologies. So another concept is a term in immunology called anergy, with an A, not E, anergy. Anergy is a term in immunobiology, that describes a lack of reaction by the body's defense mechanisms to foreign substances and consists of a direct induction of peripheral lymphocyte tolerance, immunological tolerance. Anergy is what we're all facing in the next millennium of sick patients. What we're dealing with is an explosion of people having food reactions, chemical reactions, autoimmune diseases, and we as clinicians have to understand these concepts to provide therapies for them. Does that make sense? And guess what? For ourselves too. Because we all suffer from the same fate. We have chemical exposures, we have foods that are different than ever before, we have stress, we have factors, we have antigens, we have all these things. We're all potentially losing our tolerance too, and some of us have lost it, and some of us are noticing they're losing more of their tolerance as they react to more and more foods over time. Does that make sense? And again, where this goes, when you lose energy, is you lose tolerance, tolerance to self, autoimmunity, tolerance to food, food sensitivity, and tolerance to chemicals, chemical sensitivity. That's the battle. That's where we're heading, as time goes on as clinicians. We're not really dealing anymore. You guys, do you guys really think we're dealing with the nutrient deficiency model anymore?
No.
Like, no. Because if we're dealing with the nutrition deficiency model, we wouldn't have patients come in sick with 1,000 bags of supplements. Do you know what I mean? So that model of trying to find that single iterated nutrition deficiency and trying to fix it isn't really maybe where it's all at. But we do have increased demands now for certain nutrients because of things that, for example, disrupt tolerance. All the chemicals, all the inflammatory factors, all the hybridized proteins, all the things we're consuming are causing an inflammatory reaction in our guts. So how healthy our Treg cells are can be dependent that maybe we need more vitamin D than just what we thought. Maybe we need more vitamin A. Maybe we need to support our gut healing more than before. You know what I mean? Just to stay healthy because of these stressors unrelated to a deficiency model, right? Okay. So key concept. When patients start to react to every dietary protein, they are losing their energy or they have lost their oral tolerance. Clinical strategy should be focused on improving their tolerance. So let me summarize for you guys immunological tolerance. So this is a diagram you have. And what you guys see in this diagram is on the very top, central immune tolerance, and then down here, peripheral tolerance. So immunological tolerance starts with the thymus gland itself. So you guys remember how this works. Your bone marrow cells make immature T and B cells, and they mature. T cells mature in the thymus, right? So when your bone marrow cells makes these thymus cells, some of these cells that they make, when they get interacting with what are called peptides, MCHC proteins, they will attack your own body. So these immature T cells, when they go to the thymus to mature, the thymus screens them, and if they're going to produce what are called MCHC protein expressions towards your own tissue, it destroys them. And if it's going to keep cells that don't have that, that's part of what they call positive selection. So there's this negative and positive selection where it's picking and choosing which T cells won't attack your own body. Does that make sense? So certain autoimmune diseases, people actually lose their thymus negative and positive selection. Those are the ugliest autoimmune diseases because there's no treatment or nutritional factors that really impact this too much. And one of the examples of this is myasthenia gravis. So people get autoimmunity against their acetylcholine receptor sites. They get severely disabled very, very quickly. It's really scary. Okay. Now our focus today isn't so much on central tolerance. We're going to talk about peripheral tolerance because we're talking about dietary protein. Dietary protein tolerance is all about gut immunological integration with each other, so you don't abnormally exaggerate food response to food. Okay. So the way immune tolerance works is you first ingest food. The food is basically what? Think of it from immunologically. A food peptide is an amino acid sequence potential to be attacked. Right? Have an antibody attached to it. But what makes it null and void? If those amino acid sequences break up. So how efficiently you break your food down determines how much potential target sites you have for antibodies. So digestion is really critical. We'll talk about that more and show you some research. Then once you get the peptides exposed to the gut, you have what? Dendritic cells. The dendritic cells are going to sample it, and then they're going to engulf it, and they're going to carry it into the gut lymphatic mesenteric system. And then in those lymph nodes, you have T cells and B cells, and your Treg cells are there, and then you're going to determine the severity of the reaction. So what you're seeing in this illustration is food proteins get ingested, dendritic cells and macrophages are going to engulf that food, regulatory T cells are going to have a reaction. And what's interesting is once these dendritic cells sample food and go into the lymphatic system, these mesenteric gut lymphatic systems also then also have dendritic cells go into the peripheral lymph nodes, which then goes into systemic circulation. So it goes up the thoracic duct. So what you ingest in your gut goes into the lymph node system. Those dendritic cells, they go up into your thoracic duct and through your immune system throughout your body. That's why you can get systemic inflammatory responses by T cells and B cells all throughout your body from ingesting a food protein. Also what we know is that these food proteins go from the mesenteric lymph nodes to the liver, and they interact through the portal vein, and they interact with immune cells in the liver called Kupffer cells. And the more reactive those cells are, the greater the degree of inflammation. So Kupffer cells in the liver can be activated by toxicants, inflammatory chemicals. So the more detox inability they have, the more primed they are for that to cause a reaction. Does that make sense? So I want you guys to think of a concept. Let's say we take a group of people, and just for the sake of this discussion, these people all have the same degree of leaky gut. Okay? Identical. One person has leaky gut, but they have primed and overactive Kupffer cells. Another person has leaky gut, they have Treg cell failure. Another person has leaky gut, and they have dendritic cell overactivity. So do you see there's going to be different reaction with those people? So it's not just a leaky gut. It's leaky gut plus all the factors that impact oral tolerance. We're going to discuss more of them. You understand? That's why when we just treat leaky gut, sometimes it's not enough, because we're not addressing these other factors that cause people to react to food. So this is an illustration, and let me go over this with you step by step, because I think it gets into this a little bit more clear. So here you have the gut mucosa. Antigen comes in. The antigen gets carried through Peyer's patches into the mesenteric lymph nodes. And what do you have in the mesenteric lymph nodes? Well, you have B cells and you have T cells. There are T cells and B cells, right? Well, what's going to happen is these B cells are going to make IgA, they're going to make IgM, IgG, IgE, and then your Treg cells are going to determine how much of a reaction they have. So reaction to foods does cause some production of some of these antibodies. Some people have IgA reactions and they get more classical allergy because IgE interacts with histamine. Most people will have more IgG, IgM reactions, food reactions. You understand? Okay. So that's a part of the general steps that are involved with this. Now, in this diagram, you see in the very beginning, they have barriers of variables that impact food allergy and the mechanisms associated with food allergy. Now, notice in the very top, they have SIGA. Have you guys ever looked at SIGA levels on a lab test? If you look at an adrenal profile, they include secretory IgA. If you guys ever look at GI panels, they usually include secretory IgA. What is it? What does it do? Well, it's very protective for us. And when people get under chronic stress and chronic inflammation, they become depleted. Secretory IgA engulfs bacteria, food protein peptides, viruses, so they can't interact with dendritic cells. When you lose your SIGA count, you have constant bombardment of proteins and foreign invaders to your dendritic cells. So what do you think happens to your dendritic cells? They go nuts. They get hypersensitive, they get hyperreactive. So when people lose their SIGA count, that's one of their first mechanisms of losing their oral tolerance. So stress is a major depleter. Chronic infection is a major depleter. Constant re-exposure to food sensitivities is a constant depleter of SIGA cells. Okay? So SIGA cells are critical for us to have. It's one of the key things we need to have tolerance. Now look over here, guys. You see commensal bacteria? Here's the key concept. Research is showing the more diverse your microbiome is, the more tolerance you have. Now what causes your microbiome to be diverse? A more diverse diet. But a more diverse diet of plant foods, not animal foods. So it's not like you eat chicken, lamb, and fish, and beaver daily. It's that you have a high spectrum of vegetables. So think of this model. You have a patient, you don't react to food. I want you to cut down your food list. What happens when they cut down their food list? They change their gut microbiome. How quickly? Research shows in 3 days. You have a completely different microbiome in 3 days based on what you eat. So if you have a patient that now is only eating 4 foods or 5 foods repeatedly over and over again, their gut microbiome diversity is impaired. Do you guys understand? Think of the model we've been doing for some people. You can't eat these foods. We never talk about eating more of the foods they can. It's always about restricting. You can't eat wheat, you can't eat dairy, you can't eat egg, you can't eat soy, you can't eat that, you can't eat this. My life sucks. Well, I really like asparagus, and I really like tomato, and I guess I'm okay with that, so I'm gonna eat asparagus and tomato only every day, forever. So their gut diversity immediately changes, and their oral tolerance suffers. So now what we're learning, and you guys will see in the programs and protocols we're gonna talk about, We have to get patients that have lost their tolerance to eat a diverse list of foods that they can that they don't react to, whether they like the foods or not. You know what I mean? Like, once you eat celery, I don't like celery, who cares? You don't react to it, and if you eat it, it's going to improve your diversity. You know, how about parsley? Don't like it? Good, eat that too. It doesn't matter, get it down. You know, and you can actually have people like get a Vitamix and mix up all these things that they don't necessarily like and just blend it all and drink it quickly, but it adds to their diversity. Okay, so we can't just go on removing every food antigen and not talking about how important it is to be diverse. Okay, so your SIGA count, your microbiota diversity, all matter for tolerance. Now, what you guys see in this diagram is number 1 and then number 4, and 4 is massive destruction of the intestinal membrane. So normally when food proteins go through, you can see they're digested, they're broken down, Treg cells and T cells don't overly react to them, everything's cool. And 2, they show minor defect in the barrier, and 3, they show more permeability. This is your classic leaky gut model. And then these barrier systems break down, and then these barrier systems break down, and then you have these adverse reactions to food. So these adverse reactions to food, when your body has an abnormal response to food protein, it has to destroy it by then making antibodies stick to it. That causes a lot of collateral damage, so you lose more of your lining. So this intestinal permeability thing. You know where the most prominent research is being done for intestinal permeability right now? Harvard Medical School. Dr. Fasano is at Harvard Medical School. They gave him his own lab so he can develop a zonulin blocker to treat leaky gut. Okay, I mean, this is no longer folklore, thing doesn't exist. Major research institutions are investigating this. It's in every major gut immunology, mucosal immunology journal, right? So we know that these factors can have an impact on food intolerance. Now, I want to show you this diagram and explain to you what's happening systemically with food intolerances, and we'll get into how to treat it as we move on. So here you see what I call PP. PP stands for Peyer's patches. So throughout your gut, you have an entry point for dendritic cells to get into the lymphatic system. Those are your Peyer's patches. So as you have food sampling of dendritic cells with peptides, they go into the Peyer's patches, and there's one route of these Peyer's patches into the mesenteric lymph nodes. That's where all your T cells, B cells, regulatory cells are. Then it goes into the peripheral lymphatic system through the thoracic duct, and all these food protein exposures you had get all throughout your lymphatic system, and then you can have an inflammatory response all throughout your body. That's why it's not just localized to the gut, because these things go. And then what you see here is through these Peyer's patches, there's a pathway from the portal vein directly to the liver, and how inflamed your liver is, how impaired it is in biotransformation, can mean you have a greater reaction to food. So if you have people that have detox issues and they can't metabolize toxins very well, they're going to have potentially a greater inflammatory response with their leaky gut. That's why we now realize how important it is to support hepatic biotransformation, liver detox with these people that have food intolerance issues, because it adds to the systemic inflammatory cascade. Okay? So this is a diagram that kind of summarizes what we just went over. So consumption of dietary protein. Protein antigen is broken down by digestive enzymes. The protein antigen is taken up by Peyer's patches and lamina propria, goes into the lymph, goes into the gut lymph system, goes into the systemic system, and then you have regulatory T cells making sure that there's no abnormal response. And then food antigens go into the liver, and then they eventually lead into systemic circulation as well. So dietary proteins that we sample through our dendritic cells within a very short period of time end up all throughout our lymphatic system, all throughout our body, where we have inflammatory cascades. But when they end up in the liver, they get exposed to Kupffer cells, and you can have exaggerated responses from that if your liver is not detoxing properly. And then if it gets into your thoracic duct and you have Treg failure and inflammation in other areas, you get to feel it more. Okay? So you would expect dietary protein sensitivity to cause diverse symptoms because it causes inflammation throughout the body. And wherever they already have some fire, this adds fuel to the fire. So if they have brain inflammation, they get more brain fog. If they have Hashimoto's, they get all Hashimoto's flare from dietary proteins. If they have joint inflammation, they get more joint inflammation. Make sense? Okay. Now, let's go into a key concept. So what do you do clinically? Step 1, you got to make sure they break down the protein. So key concept. Antigenicity of individual food protein decreases if the amino acid sequence is broken into amino acids. So digestive enzymes are a key initial step for patients with food immunoreactivity. Because if you have a patient that has any kind of loss of tolerance, food sensitivity, you need to make sure they're taking digestive enzymes, okay? Let me explain this to you in greater detail. So here is an example how this works. Do you guys see this amino acid sequence? That's a food, let's say that's a random amino acid sequence of a food. You guys all see that? Okay. Now, can an antibody attach to this? Yes, because they attach to what? Amino acid sequences. Can an antibody attach to just an amino acid? No. So here you see healthy digestion. You have a peptide from food, gets broken down by digestive enzymes, eventually into amino acids, no target site for immune reactivity, they get through the gut, everything's cool. Here you have lack of digestive enzymes. These amino acid chains don't get broken down. They still become target sites for antibody reactions. And even worse, since if they have intestinal permeability, if they get through, these dendritic cells will go crazy and cause severe immune reactivity, okay? So it's essential that we break down our dietary proteins. What's clinically the presentation of people who can't digest their protein? Well, they get bloating after they eat meals, especially protein meals. They feel like they have a brick in their stomach. They sometimes have an aversion to eating meat because it makes them feel really heavy because they're not digesting it. They usually get very bad breath. If it gets worse, they get some reflux, right? Those are your typical hypochlorhydria symptoms. So those are all clues to you that they may have this. Now, if you have someone who has multiple food sensitivities and they have that, and you don't adjust this protein breakdown, it can impact their tolerance expression. So these have been studied. So this is a paper that was published. It was apparent from the study that potent allergenicity of peanut, soybean, and mustard egg and milk allergens may be due, at least in part, to the resistance of proteolysis in the stomach. If they don't break down these proteins, they become more reactive to them. Here's another study. Gastric digestion substantially decreases the potential of food proteins to bind IgE, which increases the threshold dose of allergens required to elicit symptoms in patients with food allergy. They're saying is if you break down the protein, it becomes less allergenic. Okay? So we put together, by the way, we put together a protocol how we support oral tolerance very simply and easily, all put together for a patient to follow. I'll share that with you guys. But one of the things you'll see on that is it definitely includes digestive enzymes and definitely digestive enzymes that are very high in proteases and HCl. So in our protocol, you guys will see a product called Enzymix Pro. This is my favorite digestive enzyme because it has a spectrum of all the different enzymes you need to digest starches and carbohydrates and fibers, but it has such a strong mix of compounds to break down protein. Bromelain, HCl, pepsin, proteases 1 through 5, peptidase. Those are just ensuring that you break down those peptide sequence chains into individual amino acids. That's what we want. It also helps break down starch and fats. Those are in there as well. Okay? So we'll use that in our protocol. And another thing that we sometimes have to consider when we look at oral tolerance, the most reactive protein we know about right now is milk and wheat. So Apex has a product called Gluten Flam, and there's some things in here. The key thing that's in here, one of the things in here is the DPP4 protease. DPP4 protease is the enzyme that specifically breaks down wheat and milk protein. So you guys, if you ingest wheat and milk protein and you react to it, as long as you have the peptide sequence, you're going to still react to it. You're going to stop reacting to it when you break it down into smaller peptides and amino acids. Does that make sense? That's why when people get exposure to something like milk and wheat or to protein, it's critical that you give them enzymes to immediately break it down so there's no target sites for antibodies to bind to and promote the inflammatory reaction. Okay? Now, the other thing that's in Gluten Flam that makes it very useful is not only do they have the DP4 protease and these enzymes here for the brush border, but in the celiac disease literature, what they found, once the dendritic cell enters the gut lumen and activates T cells, they've actually found aloe vera, lycopene, luteolin, and quercetin block that dendritic trigger to T cells. So that's why we want to do both. We want to break that enzyme, but that immune reaction is already taking place, so we want to block that as well. So we always use that. So we always, tend to use Gluten Flam with people that have sensitivity to it. We have them carry around with them all the time if they get exposed. So not only do they break down the protein immediately, but they also stop that dendritic T cell response that can take place. And we obviously use the digestive enzymes. So let's move on. So that's one aspect of tolerance. Here's the key thing. You see a patient with food intolerance, you immediately think of, you got to break down those proteins. Any signs that they're not digesting their protein can perpetuate their tolerance issues. Okay, and here's how tolerance works. The more you rev it up, the worse it gets. So if they're constantly getting exposed to undigested peptides, you're going to constantly trigger their tolerance or immune reactivity to dietary proteins, and you create this inflammatory cascade that continues to go on. Now, here's another key concept related to digestion. Antigenicity of individual food protein may increase with food coloring due to inability to properly digest protein, leading to increased peptide antigen presentation due to intestinal mucosa. Foods with food coloring should be avoided by those who have impaired oral tolerance. So let me show you how this works with the research. Here's a peptide, guess what? And then you have a food coloring attached to it. That's why when foods change color from food coloring, the food coloring is actually attaching to the protein. Okay? So here's an illustration that was published in this paper. They go in to show when you have an amino acid sequence chain, enzymes come in and break it up, right? Which then makes it less immune reactive. But food coloring impairs its breakdown. And if you impair the breakdown, you have antibodies to the sequence, what happens? You have a reaction. Right? So, you know there's gluten in jelly beans. Okay? So what if someone has gluten sensitivity and they eat jelly beans with food coloring? It's going to be much worse because the coloring is getting in the way to break down that gluten compound. So now they eat jelly beans and are now sick for 5 days versus eating something that didn't have food coloring in it. Okay. So this is a study you can see here. Take a look at this. The blue line represents albumin digested over a 60-minute period. And the red one is albumin with food coloring added to it. So when you look at albumin, within 60 minutes, you can see it's getting digested pretty well, right? Pretty quickly. They take the same protein, albumin, add food coloring to it, and look at how it's digesting. It's not. So what that means is this sequence is hanging out, which then perpetuates the length of the immune reactive response. Okay? So when people lose their oral tolerance, clinically, you look for digestive enzymes that are supportive to give them to them. You get them off food coloring, especially with foods they're sensitive to. Worst combination is lack of enzymes, exposure to the food, and that food has food coloring added to it. That's devastating. Okay. So that's one part of this tolerance-related mechanism. So you guys remember, see this diagram we went over? One part of tolerance is breaking down proteins by digestive enzymes. You guys see how critical that is? Okay. Now let's move on. Antigenicity of individual food proteins may increase with intestinal immune responses for immune dysregulation, promotion of intestinal permeability. So this basically what it's saying is that leaky gut is a factor. I think most of you guys know that, and this is in the literature. Food intolerance and mucosal inflammation are deeply related because tolerance cannot be established when there's inflammation in the intestinal mucosa. Because when the gut is inflamed, you can't fix tolerance issues. So we have to, get them on the anti-inflammatory protocols we'll go over. Now here's a question for you guys. If someone gets exposed to a food protein that they're sensitive to, how long does it take for them to get leaky gut? What time frame? And then how long does it take to heal? Is it repeated exposures that then cause leaky gut? Is it one exposure over so many days? Can you heal if you avoid those foods for a good 3 weeks and fast? Does it go away? So guess what? These researchers investigated that. They actually looked at the timing. Okay, so let me share this abstract with you. Real-time responses to food antigens can be monitored by conofocal laser endomicroscopy. Okay? So, compared with baseline levels, exposure to these candidate food antigens, take food antigens, they cause immediate breaks within 5 minutes in the gut epithelium. One exposure within 5 minutes broke down the tight junctions. Pretty quick. And then lymphocytes, they showed lymphocytes and inflammatory responses took place. One exposure, in 5 minutes, the tight junctions are breaking down. How long did it take to heal? Guess. Upon implementation of a diet that excludes the trigger, they removed the trigger. Food antigen symptom scores improved by 50% in patients after 4 weeks. Only 50%. With improvements increasing to 74% after 6 months of a diet. Even after 6 months, it didn't completely heal. That's why it's so critical to use things like glutamine and DGL and flavonoids to speed up the healing time, because this can go on for months and months and months. And especially if you have continued exposure and continued tolerance loss, which also goes to how long does it take to fix tolerance? Guys, it can take months to fix someone's tolerance issues. Does that make sense? And I don't know if for some people you can actually always fix it completely. You just make them more tolerant to foods or less reactive to foods, so they don't have as bad of an inflammatory pattern, because some people get really wound up in these dysfunctions. So everybody see how that works? So you guys will see in our approach, not only do we want digestive proteins broken down, we want to avoid food coloring, we want them to eat a diverse list of foods, as much of foods that they can tolerate, to get that microbiome diversity, right? We also still don't forget the importance of leaky gut. We have to still go on there and support their intestinal permeability. So it's not an exchange of, it's in addition to leaky gut. We have to use other things, but it's still a key factor. And you can see how long it takes just with diet alone, even just fast, not getting exposed, how long it takes to heal that. Okay, now, do you guys remember the regulatory T cells? Critical cells, right? You need to have them for tolerance. They determine how active your T cells become. So here's what they found in the literature. Short-chain fatty acids are critical activators of regulatory T cells for energy. Consumption of fiber, supplementation of short-chain fatty acids may be considered. So this is a paper that was published in Nature and Science, one of the top journals in the world. And what they show is that when people actually eat fibrous foods, these fibers interact with the gut microbiota. They then get metabolized into short-chain fatty acids, acetate, propionate, and butyrate. And then these activate regulatory T cells in the gut, which then improve tolerance. Okay? So here's how this works. You have a lot of people that end up with leaky gut, and what do they immediately become? Grain-free. Grain-free, and avoid all these foods. They limit their diet, they decrease their fiber intake, and then all the recipe you need to lose your tolerance further. Okay? So we have a protocol. We'll go over it, how we support tolerance for patients. This is a patient booklet. One of the things you guys see in there, besides having encouraged them to eat a diverse diet, is we encourage them to take like a teaspoon of flax seeds or chia seeds or psyllium. You can mix it with water, or if they're not reacting to almond milk, that's the easy way to do it, just to do it. But you can directly support the Treg cells very effectively with just short-chain fatty acids. Propionate, butyric acid, propionate being the key ones. And in studies, it shows that if you give people short-chain fatty acids, you actually improve their immune homeostasis in their gut. And this is what we use in our protocol. We use enterovite. Enterovite is short-chain fatty acids. Short-chain fatty acids support Treg cell function in the gut. This could be one of the single most important nutrients to provide with people that have lost their dietary tolerance. It's not just leaky gut support. You want to improve their Treg functions. Okay? So we use the enterovite in our protocol in addition to the Enzyme Mix Pro, in addition to a diverse diet. And then as we move on to these immune-related factors, the other two key nutrients that are really critical for tolerance, especially for dendritic cells, are vitamin A and vitamin D. So vitamin A and vitamin D support healthy dendritic activity, which supports intestinal health. Now here's the other thing. Vitamin A also supports regeneration of secretory IgA cells. Why are they important? Because they attach to food proteins and peptides so that dendritic cells don't get constantly exposed. Takes the pressure off them. Okay? Vitamin A also helps modulate T cell function. D is a key Treg stimulator and a dendritic cell stimulator. How many of your patients have D deficiencies? A lot of them, most of them. And then vitamin D has also been shown to help leaky gut repair. So when someone loses their tolerance, we want them on high amounts of vitamin A and vitamin D. So research has shown vitamin A is key to immune tolerance in the gut. Vitamin D is critical to dendritic cells and immune reactivity in the body. So in our protocol, you guys will see that we use for oral tolerance, we include liquid A and liquid D. And I personally really love these drops. Drops are so easy to take. Each of these drops provide 2,000 IUs, just a few drops, in the morning, a few drops a day. You get tons of vitamin A, tons of vitamin D very easily, and less capsules to swallow makes it an effective way to do it, okay? So you guys will see in our protocol for oral tolerance, we'll have liquid A, liquid D in there because of their effects on dendritic cells and Treg cells, and this research showing they're key nutrients for tolerance-related pathways. Now as we continue on, So let me summarize where we are. Someone comes into you and they say, I have sensitivities to multiple foods, and this is getting old because I can't eat anything anymore. And you go, what are you eating? Well, I'm not telling you. Well, let me start with this. Let me tell you what I'm not eating. I'm not eating this, and I'm eating this, and I'm eating this. Oh, I miss this so much. And they go through this list of things not eating. So what are you eating? And then what you'll find out is they have a small list of foods they eat. They could be expanded. They just aren't used to eating other foods. Does that make sense? Now, what you have to do is, let's say you find this out too. You find out from them, they eat protein, but they don't eat too much of it because they feel like they can't digest it and they feel heavy all day. What do they just tell you? They're not breaking down protein. Could that impact their tolerance? Yes. Okay. They tell you that their vitamin D levels are low, but they keep forgetting to take it. Could that impact their tolerance? Yes. Right? So these things can all add up, and we want to manage all of them together. Now, once you get past all that, there's another component to this, which is the mast cell response. You guys remember that video we saw? Eventually, the antibodies attached to the mast cells that release histamine. Well, that histamine reaction can promote the inflammatory responses here. So in this key concept, we want to also mention that we want to do things to improve that mast cell response. So when antigens come in and then they actually trigger mast cells down here, there's a list of natural compounds that have been published that have been shown to block this cascade. Quercetin, ginger, butterbar, stinging needle, mangosteen. These have all been shown to dampen the immune response to releasing histamines. Okay? And Apex has these all formulated in a product called Histo-X. Okay? And they have in the back, if you guys are interested, they have this beautiful brochure. It's called Immune Regulation, Accuracy, and Response to Food Environmental Triggers. It's a literature review of all the published studies on those ingredients they use in Histo-X. Okay? So if you guys want to see the actual research what's been published, it's pretty good a piece of work and lots of good information there. So one of the things we also add into our oral tolerance issue is blocking that histamine cascade to make a difference there. Now, you guys all have this brochure. You guys see this? So this is what we use in our practice to help patients improve their oral tolerance. So if you guys see a patient and you want to teach them about oral tolerance and you want to give them a protocol of all the things to address that pathway, it's all here. Okay? Now, a review of everything we talked about is in these paragraphs, but it's patient-friendly to read it. So it talks about dendritic cells and vitamin D and all that stuff and how important those steps are. And then what you guys will see is in the back of it, first of all, there's dietary support, and then there's nutritional support. And the key thing with the diet is eat a diverse list of foods as you can. Try to eat as much diverse list of foods as you can. Get that microbiome diverse, especially plant products, to really get that diversity. And then if you guys go to the very last page, you guys will see this protocol like this. Do you see that? Okay. So let me go over this. In the morning for breakfast, and the way this is dosed is they take most things in the morning, most things at night, because most patients have a hard time taking supplements during lunch because of work and life and those things, right? So in the morning and with every meal, what you guys will see on this list is Enzyme X Pro. Enzyme X Pro is the digestive enzyme supplement that has all the proteases and the peptase and the HCl to make sure they're breaking down their proteins into amino acids. That's critical for tolerance. You'll see glutathione recycler there. Glutathione supports Treg cells. Glutathione helps intestinal cell repair. Glutathione helps hepatic biotransformation, phase 1, phase 2. It's critical. But here's the thing. There's some studies one study that was published, and what they did is they took animals, they infected the intestinal mucosa with antigens, and they found the antigen didn't destroy the gut barrier until glutathione was depleted. So glutathione is a key antioxidant that preserves the intestinal barrier. Key activator of Treg cells, key pathway for phase 1, phase 2, all the things we need for oral tolerance. So we want to put them on support for glutathione in the morning. Histo-X blocks that histamine pathway nutritionally. And then Liquid A, Liquid D, these are the vitamins. And then Clearvite GL is the liver hepatic biotransformation. Let's take a couple of sips of that. So literally they wake up with their breakfast, take some digestive enzymes, and take a couple capsules, a couple drops, and then a quick drink. Then they take enzymes for lunch. And then at dinner, they add some probiotics in, which is a Cbiotica. They add in short-chain fatty acids. Why are short-chain fatty acids important? They activate Treg cells. And then they take more vitamin A, more vitamin D, and then they take RepairVite SC, and this is a very non-reactive form of leaky gut support. and you try to heal their leaky gut. So what we're doing in this protocol is we're trying to support their dendritic cells, support their leaky gut, support their phase 1, phase 2 biotransformation, give them the key antioxidant they need. And it's actually not too hard to implement when you see it kind of put together. Does that make sense? So it's as simple as going, hey, here's what we need to do in the next so many weeks. Here's your protocol. I want you to, let's really talk about diversifying your diet, what are you eating, and then you go through it from that model. So you're still supporting leaky gut and detox pathways, but you're adding all these other factors that are critical when you support tolerance. And I can tell you, this is where we need to go in our practice, because we have too many patients on a leaky gut protocol that still have, it's not healing, they're still not responding to it, they still have multiple food sensitivities. We're addressing these other factors that are critical for their immune reactions to foods. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So that's the approach to tolerance. You guys have the brochure, you have the product applications to incorporate that in your office. Let's add one more dimension to this topic. What about food allergy testing? Food sensitivity testing, do you do it? Do you not do it? What does it tell you? How do you incorporate it? Those are critical steps, okay? How many of you guys are doing food sensitivity testing in your office now? Most of you? Okay. So you guys, when you look at food sensitivity testing, there are basically two types of tests, two categories. Antibody testing and cytotoxic testing. So cytotoxic testing are things like LCAT testing or MRT testing or LRA testing. And then there's your classical antibody testing. Now, I will tell you right off the bat, cytotoxic testing doesn't have much evidence, much support. I don't think the science is there at all. And let me tell you what's published on it, what we know about it. So cytotoxic testing, basically what they do is they expose the dietary protein to a macrophage and see if the macrophage enlarges. That's what a cytotoxic T-test is. Okay, and there's lots of problems with that and lots of things that get in the way. First of all, it's non-specific to any food. I mean, there's no immunoglobulin A or G or M. You can't measure cross-reactivity because no antibodies you're checking. The testing is banned in many states because it's not reliable. There's no reproducibility. So lab licensing organizations won't allow it to be done in their states. Different test results have been reported in publications. Poor reproducibility. They give the same blood sample and do the test over and over again. It's not the same results. So it's not really a lot of science, but most of these labs promote it as, this is the cutting edge stuff, this is how you check stuff, but no one in the field of immunology believes that. And you don't see papers published in the immunology literature that have any support of this. There's some random papers, but you don't see people doing this in this field because they kind of seeing it as a non-specific general test with very poor reproducibility, okay? Antibody testing is the gold standard. That's where all the research is done. That's how you measure cross-reactivity. So I would tell you that's the way to do it, in my personal opinion. So let me show you the big picture. You guys remember this? Antigen comes in, interacts with the antigen-presenting cell in the gut, the dendritic cell. The first thing that happens is it engulfs, it gets larger. Now, that's cytotoxic testing. What immune response it generates, which immunoglobulin, how aggressive, which type, is not measured. Ultimately, this response, if it actually matters, has to do what? Make antibodies, these Y-shaped things. So it's much more clinically specific and accurate when you forget this step and go right to what really matters. Does that make sense? So here's how it looks. This is a cytotoxic testing, like LCAT. Take a food, expose it to a macrophage, it engulfs it. So what? Did something happen? Did it matter? Did it not matter? Were there antibodies produced? Was there an actual immunological reaction? You don't know. Okay? Now, think of antigen-antibody reaction. You take pure protein. You take the patient's own blood antibody and see if it actually attaches to that pure protein. Specific antibody, specific antigen, boom, there you go. So it's very clear. I mean, as far as the research and what most people in immunology and food testing world believe, this is the way to do it, okay? So the advantage of antibody testing is obviously it's more specific, it's more accurate, all the research is behind it. It's what the rest of the immunologists are doing. They're not doing LCAT because they don't know about it. People know about it. It's just considered a non-reproducible, non-specific test. Non-specific because getting engulfment of a protein peptide doesn't mean anything. Okay? So the test we do with antibodies is Cyrex, and for me, as you guys know, Dr. Vajani is my mentor, and he's the chief scientific advisor for Cyrex, and he's the first person to do food allergy testing. So we use the Cyrex testing in our office, okay? Now, this is one of these papers that talks about food allergy testing. All commercial food antigens are prepared from raw food. All commercial antigens, all food sensitivity testing is measured from raw food. So Cyrex is the only lab that checks cooked. And because Dr. Vajani is one of the pioneers who discovered that in his research and publications, and that's why they check foods that are eaten in cooked form, foods that are eaten in raw form, and those that are eaten in both forms with both mechanisms to check, okay? So in the Cyrex panel, what you guys will see, egg white, cooked, egg yolk, cooked, right? And then you'll see a list of other proteins that they checked, cooked, or boiled, or raw, based on how people normally eat it. Now, one of the things that Dr. Vajani has done with his research on food sensitivity for the past, 40 years, is he found certain foods are very reactive, but certain proteins in foods is really where the immune reactivity target site is. So corn has an actual protein called aquaporin, and so does other foods. And aquaporin is a target site for immune reactions. So what he's done in his lab is he's purified aquaporin into the well, so you actually have more of it to catch the antibody reaction. And then he's found, for example, the proteins in corn called corn allantoin can also be another target site. So he's made another well for corn allantoin just to make sure that that's not missed if some people have subtle reactions. So for example, corn's a common food sensitivity, so he checks corn with corn aquaporin, popped corn, meaning corn treated with heat, corn allantoin as an example for what he thought was the most critical parts of food protein to check for common allergens. Okay, so we like to do the array 10 because it helps us get more accurate information. Everybody okay with that? Now, when you get food sensitivity panels back, there's two things that I consider. Does the patient have reactions to most foods or just a few foods? You guys understand? So let's say you do a food sensitivity panel on one of your patients and it comes back and more than half the foods are off the chart. So what have they lost? They've lost their tolerance. So here's a little flow chart, how I approach it. If they, for example, you get the array 10 results back, they react to most foods, I immediately know what? They lost their oral tolerance. So here's the next question. Do you avoid all the foods that they reacted to? If they had 200 something foods checked, let's say they had 210 foods checked, and they had 120 food reactions. Do you remove all 120 dietary proteins? No. So what I do is that becomes my baseline biomarker. I go, this panel right now is your baseline for where your oral tolerance is right now, how reactive you are to food, okay? Then what I do is I have them only avoid the foods they know directly cause symptoms, because with people that see almost all these food reactions, you'll see something like cucumber or something show up and they don't really have major reactions against it. If they eat it, they don't really notice anything, right? Now, I want them to be exposed to those foods because I'm going to go into a strategy, to support their oral tolerance for the next 2 to 3 months, and then have them repeat the test and see if I'm seeing the list of foods change and get smaller. So what if they reacted to over 100 foods and then after 2 or 3 months of not really changing their diet, except ones that directly cause symptoms, and now they only have 30 foods instead of 100 foods? What happened in the past 3 months? Their tolerance improved. Does that make sense? So that initial test doesn't become a test for me to go, don't eat this, don't eat this, don't eat this. It becomes a test of, this is now my marker for your tolerance. And we're going to support your dietary protein tolerance and see if it changes. Does that make sense to all of you? Okay? And you guys, that's where we're going with a lot of sick patients. A lot of sick patients, those food sensitivity tests, everything's showing up on them because they are reacting to all those things. And they're reacting to all those things because they lost their tolerance. To avoid those foods and give them a new diet is only going to cause them to react to the new foods, and you don't really fix the problem in the first place. Okay? And what we're realizing, it's not just leaky gut. That's because we have done that. We've taken patients and go, oh, we react to all these foods, let's fix your leaky gut. Oh, it's not getting better. And we've totally neglected these other pathways in tolerance, like Treg cells and dendritic cells and glutathione and hepatic biotransformation and how important it is to break down proteins, right? So now we know we have to engage all those things, and that becomes your baseline test. Okay? More than likely, if you guys are dealing with a lot of chronic people, you're going to see more patients that have multiple food reactions than just a few. Now, if they just have a few food reactions, you as a clinician may feel it's important to remove it permanently or remove it temporarily. You can still support their tolerance. You can still check to see how they do. That's your call. Now remember, if a patient avoids a food for, let's say, 2 to 3 months, they're going to have false negatives if you retest, because there's no antibodies there. And if you have a person eat a food protein, the antibodies will peak in 2 weeks. So if they eat a protein, make sure you wait at least 2 weeks to retest. That's your goal, okay? So let me give you some clinical examples of this flow chart and think about what you would do. So let's say you do a panel on someone and you see the following thing. The first page of the report shows they have some reactions to egg. Anything in yellow or red is a food reactivity response. Green is no reaction. So they have some reaction to egg. On the second page, they don't have any reactions to these vegetables. Third page, no problem. Fourth page, just some reaction, I think, to seaweed, and then, I don't know, blueberry, a couple other fruits. No reaction on the next page, or one reaction. But for the most part, you're only finding a few foods that they react. Do you think this person's lost their tolerance? No. So, you could avoid those foods for a while. You could still go in there and support their tolerance, have them eat those foods, and check it again and see how they do, okay? But let's take a look at this scenario. Patient comes in, they do rate 10 through Cyrex, and they show up with all these reactions on the first page, all these reactions on the second page, all these reactions on the third page. So you're seeing definitely more than half of these things starting to show up. Almost all the reactions on this page. More reactions here to things in yellow and red, and then yellow and red, and then more reactions there. So do you go to this patient and go, I just want you to eat the green? No, you guys, that's crazy. And if you do that, what do you do to their microbiodiversity? You limit it. So here's what I would do. I'd go, hey, this is your baseline for your tolerance. We're going to compare this test. Are there any of these foods that cause a reaction? Well, I know milk does. Milk makes me get sinus, avoid milk. Anything else? Yeah, well, I know wheat makes me have, okay, so avoid milk, wheat, anything else? Maybe soy, fine. Maybe it means you avoid it. How about the rest? Not really. Okay, great. We're going to put you on this protocol. We'll give them this 2 to 3 months. We're going to retest this panel in 2 to 3 months and see if your system is improving. Now, if it's improving, that means what? You're facing their tolerance. And if you improve their dietary protein tolerance, you're decreasing their risk for getting self-tolerance and autoimmunity and chemical tolerance and those factors as well. So does that make sense to you guys? Those are the applications we have. So those are the key things I wanted to share with you guys. So here's a summary of everything so far. We know many people have reactions to foods, and leaky gut protocols are not enough. Giving people just things to repair their gut lining is not doing it for most of these people. And we've totally neglected these other pathways, and that's why we've kind of have to step it up, and we've had to go into this, whole mucosal tolerance approach to managing cases. So, key concept, remember, denaturing, heat changes your food. So when you look at food sensitivity testing, know that raw food is being tested unless they put protein. Foods combined together cause reactions. Notice that some antibodies can actually cause cross-reactivity with tissues. This is where an autoimmune patient becomes dangerous. Also remember that foods that share amino acid sequence homology can react on a panel even though they don't eat them because of that. And remember that when people come in with loss of all these, when people lose their tolerance to show with multiple food sensitivities, remember how critical digestive enzymes are, because you don't react to a food, you react to what? Amino acid sequence chain. You want to break that sequence chain as soon as possible to avoid immune reactivity. Enzymes are really critical for that. Remember, food coloring gets in the way of breakdown. Make sure your patients avoid that. Intestinal permeability is still a factor. Supporting regulatory T cells with short-chain fatty acids, vitamin A, vitamin D, glutathione are critical. A and D being the most important ones. Block that mast cell response. And then here's you guys remember this tolerance pathway? Here's where each of these things fit in. You guys see that? And that's this. And then for this is also in this histo-X, blocks all these pathways. So that's the goal. So the summary is this. With people that lose immune tolerance, you support their intestinal permeability, you support the regulatory T cell function, you get them to have a diverse diet so they can improve their microbiome diversity, you encourage protein breakdown with enzymes, support the dendritic cells, and then make sure the biotransformation pathways are working. Okay, and there's the brochure to help you with that, to summarize everything. Okay, thank you so much.